MS initially was sort of based on some of the MS Canary implementations were originally based on StackGuard and then kind of moved to stuff that's more comparable to what ProPolice does. The GS cookie is basically the ProPolice guard value. I guess I should say that Hiroki doesn't like to call it a canary, so he calls it a guard value. It is an XOR of the pointer and the random value of the pointer stored off stack. One of the big things about ProPolice is that it moves to all addresses or to all registers. In Prolog, it's a well-ordered stack. The variables and arrays are at the bottom. Actually, here's a slide about just that. For me, ProPolice, I never understood the name. What made it, a police officer. And actually, it's kind of a pun that I guess is funny to Hiroki. ProPolice is the stuff that bees use to construct their hives. And to me, that really kind of helped me understand it a little better, that it's not just a canary implementation. So what you're doing with ProPolice is you're trying to create a well-ordered stack. And so in the case of what a ProPolice safe stack looks like, you have arguments and return addresses, and then your previous frame pointer, the guard value, and then arrays and local variables separated. Most stack-based overflows are about passing things to arrays and then overriding the return address. So if you lay out your stack a little bit better, those vulnerable sections of memory are not adjacent to each other. So the well-ordered stack may be more important actually as far as how ProPolice works. It may actually be more important than the canary stuff. Something else that I asked a lot of people about was heap canary stuff. There's a lot of talks on the heap lately that this has become an area of a lot of interest because a lot of the exploit mitigation stuff doesn't really do much for the heap. There are a couple of implementations out there for guard pages and canary type implementations on the heap. ContraPolice is one of those. WKR, and I didn't get a chance to find out what his initials stood for. I've read some of his stuff before. He's been involved in DEF CON CTF over the years and some other things, but he did a guard page implementation for DL malloc. The OpenBSD guys have a G option in malloc conf. In the case of OpenBSD, it's optional. It's not turned on by default, and the reason for that is that it does break some stuff, but it's worth looking at, especially for critical systems and things you want to protect. It is likely to be something you're going to see down the road. As the heap becomes of more interest, I think that you'll probably see this integrated more, and people are going to start to look at the same kind of method, the same kind of model of canaries and guard pages for the heap. If the canary is the key element in protecting the stack, though, the defense is only as good as the canary. So Gerardo Richart of Corsec looked at global offset table writes and some things to the stack frame pointer. All of his stuff was specific to Stack Shield and GS and StackGuard. One of the things that the core guys say when they talk about this is they didn't find much to effectively defeat ProPolice. And I looked for information about things that were successful against ProPolice and didn't find a whole lot out there. Bulba and Killer in FRAC 56 found some other weaknesses in StackGuard, and again, I think probably the fatal flaw of StackGuard was that it primarily was just focused on return address. So because of that, any other area of memory that you could arbitrarily write to would give you the same result. And really where that came from is at the time, that was kind of the classic stack-based overflow. And so the defensive mechanism was kind of thinking about the attacks, but not thinking about all the possible vectors. One of the things about canaries is that if it is somewhere in readable memory, so format string bugs and things that lead to memory leakage may give you ways to overwrite canaries. And so there's some possible ways to get around it there. So the next step was ASLR, which is big news these days because it's in Vista. It's fundamentally misdirection. Let's shuffle address space. You have a randomized userland, kernel stack, mmap in PAX, which was kind of one of the first folks to implement this. OpenBSD has added a lot of these things. ExecShield in Red Hat does their own ASLR implementation. I have no idea why they didn't use PAX. If somebody works for Red Hat and can tell me, I'd be interested to know. But they went ahead and built their own ASLR. It's not quite as robust as PAX, but it's authored by Red Hat, so maybe that's why they like it. With Vista, we've added random exe, DLL loaders. As Whitehouse pointed out, there's varying degrees of entropy. It's a little more predictable than it probably should be. For apps to utilize ASLR internally in Vista, you do have to pass compiler flags to do that. Like I say, it is a little bit weaker on the heap. Something with that in terms of the dynamic base stuff is pick or pi, position-independent executables in code. Just randomizing your DLLs and just randomizing your libraries in and of itself doesn't get you a lot if the app that's running in memory still has known offsets and it's still predictable. So you really have to build executables to take advantage of that same functionality. I talked to an MS guy the other day about this, and one of the things he said is building with dynamic base in Visual Studio 05 SV1 makes apps impossible to debug, and so they really hate it. Because when you randomize the app, when you send somebody a crash dump, it's not applicable to them. So the developers are sort of up in arms about some of it. John Moser of Ubuntu Harden, makes an estimate that with pick and pi, you've got stack random bits, mmap random bits, and so you increase substantially the ability to predict addresses for attacks. And like I said, it's kind of key to a full implementation of ASLR. If the app itself uses predictable addresses, ASLR really doesn't do you a whole lot of good. So what you end up with then with ASLR is brute force approaches to try to defeat the randomization. Hovav Shacham, this stuff, I didn't find a lot of people that were exposed to this guy. He is an Israeli cryptographer, and he got interested in ASLR with PAX, and he looked at this and said, hey, this is just bad crypto, right? So he built there's a paper that he's got where he built a vulnerable version of Apache, created some vulnerabilities in it, and then used a de-randomization attack to brute force the location of known offset libraries in libc and things like that, and then return to libc. So what he found was that an ASLR-protected Apache could be brute forced in about 200 seconds. So it didn't do a whole lot of good. Now that's on, and he makes a point to sort of clarify that is on a 32-bit platform, and ASLR on 64-bit is better. He has some insane new stuff about return to libc with no function calls, where he chains different sequences together. I guess I would just say, just a takeaway, something to look at. Really just mind-blowing guy. Something I'm curious about myself is Shacham on the heap. Vista does have a functionality that on restart of a service, if the service crashes and restarts like 3 times, it stops, which should help to defeat some of this. But when you're talking about things like client-side, you can try as many times as you want. And so when you're looking at the heap with weak randomization, how many tries would that take to do return to libc as like a local client-side exploit? Ben Hawks did a talk at RuxCon just a little while ago, code access brute forcing, which was a series of failed reads to infer addresses in memory. And most of what I would say about this is, and just in general, is that most of the methods to defeat ASLR relate to known offset libraries, and so you can kind of identify this looks like the system call. And so then what you're doing is just probing around in memory until you stumble across it. And then pre-linking and some of the things that you do at compile time can also make those addresses more predictable. Mentioned Ollie Whitehouse's stuff a couple of times. Very good talk if you didn't check it out. Pull the slides. So, Cliff Notes, no exec in NX. If it's runtime configurable and it's an opt-in model, it's useless. There's lots and lots of other exploitation methods. NX in and of itself doesn't do you a whole lot of good. ASLR, bad crypto, is not a panacea. Any way that you can leak addresses and any kind of vulnerability that would lead to a memory leak could give you ways to identify things in memory. So in particular, one of the things that actually there was a Tyler Durden did a frac paper a while back about taking format string bugs that were not exploitable but leaked memory to then find addresses to exploit with return to libc for another vulnerability. So you have like an aggregate. If your address-based randomization is identifiable in some way, then it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. Again, with canaries, it's, if it's bad crypto, it's guessable, or there's some way to get a hold of it, it doesn't do you a lot of good. Any write to memory space requires some protection. So if you're just protecting the return address, it doesn't do you a lot of good either. So the best practice, and this is kind of where we're at, this is where we sit now, is that we have the mesh model or security in depth or the onion, whatever you guys call it, of integrating a lot of ineffective measures and hope that the aggregate of all of those ineffective measures is something that's pretty effective. And from what I've read of people's analysis of Vista, and obviously people have had a lot of good things to say about OpenBSD for a number of years with some of these things. The combination of a non-executable stack, ASLR, canary values, and all of these other methods together probably does put you in a pretty good spot. So we're just getting started. It's been 19 years that we've known about sort of this problem. What else can we do to make this a little more difficult? Well, the Weld-Pond talk right after this, static code analysis. Look for things in code that are likely vectors, sources of problems. GCC Fortify Source is a series of patches that were added to GCC that do, basically they take SPAF's advice and they take things like string copy, replace it with string copy. They actually include some checks for format strings, which this is actually about the only thing I found that really does anything about format string-based stuff on an automated basis. So they will look for things that are kind of misallocated and say, you instantiated kind of this many values, and then up here you called it has fewer values than that. The Coverity DHS project was kind of big news this year. Vendor Coverity got a big contract from the DHS to do analysis of open source projects and look for vulnerabilities. We are seeing some value from what they're doing. Ben Laurie pointed out that it's really nice of DHS to fund people to look for bugs in open source code. It would be even nicer if they paid people to fix them, which is kind of part of the problem. We're identifying all this stuff, but then these projects are then now scrambling to correct the things that are found. Lots of commercial tools. Something about static code analysis. Rice's theorem. Rice, I guess, was a contemporary of Turing, and he talked about how for a given problem set, if there's a sort of an infinite number of answers, you can't really find it. And then I sort of call that Rumsfeld's corollary to Rice's theorem. We know what we know what we don't know, but we don't know what we don't know. And so, with the automated tools, there's going to be things that this will help with, but there's always going to be things that we're not going to find that way. So one of the other pieces that will help with containment of vulnerabilities is access control models. It's not specifically a method to stop an exploit, but it does help contain the exposure after the fact. You're restricting file access, you're doing things like that. The Linux world, you've got RSPAC and GRSec and AppArmor and SE Linux. Does anybody use SE Linux? Okay.